My father's funeral held a hidden truth that broke me inside. I stood at the front of the chapel, hands folded as if I could hold the world together, and watched my wife check her watch again and again, 7 times in 20 minutes. The small movement was absurd against the gravity of the day. The polished oak casket, the bouquet of white lilies, the hush broken only by Pastor Williams reading a passage about endurance. Outside, November wind skated across the parking lot, rattling the bare branches like an impatient audience. Inside, every breath felt sacred and raw. I should have been holding my mother. I should have been steady for Angela. Instead, my eyes kept finding that anxious wrist. I remember the first time I noticed it, really noticed it, the way a single repeated motion can suddenly mean everything. The first time felt like a quirk. By the third time, I felt a prickle along my neck. By the 7th, there was an ache that no prayer seemed to touch. If you like intense, true story turns, subscribe. There's more of this kind of story coming. I had always thought of grief as a kind of weather. It would roll in, saturate everything for a while, then, eventually, the sky would clear and the work of living would begin again. My father's death blew a hole in that assumption. The grief was not homogeneous. It arrived in waves, sharp, cold, and then a slow, tugging sorrow that lived in the small, ordinary things. The smell of his aftershave still ghosting on his jacket. The way his mug had a ragged chip at the rim that he loved because it fit his thumb. It was there in the hymnals with their dog-eared pages, and the way Pastor Williams' voice quavered when he said my father's name. But grief can be noisy, and sometimes what breaks the silence is not the thing you expected. While I was folding the weight of my loss into the careful pockets of my days, that watch checking kept marking time like a metronome no one could turn off. I watched her more than I looked at him. I found myself counting, 1, 2, 3, wondering what the count was for. We buried him in the small cemetery outside town. Margaret, my mother, stood with Angela beside her, faces like carved stone, as if they'd been made of all the prayers they had never spoken aloud. The minister said what ministers say at funerals, that death does not have the last word, that memory and legacy remain. I wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe that a man who spent his life running late-night shifts at the factory and fixing lawnmowers could leave something more than a handful of coins and a worn toolbox. But I did not yet know what he had left. Earlier that week, when the doctors had called to say there wasn't anything more they could do, I had watched my father sit very still in his old armchair. He looked small and tired, but there was a peculiar steadiness in the way he folded his hands and listened to me as I told him we were going to be okay, though we both knew what okay meant.
He smiled in that resigned, private way he always did, and he asked after the garden. That memory felt like a bright shard until the watch checking began to cast a shadow over everything else. We met Frida in grad school, an unanticipated collision of ambition and laughter. She could talk about curriculum design the way some people spoke of music. It's in all the details, the rhythm, the build. I was the kind of person who loved the classroom because of the small, stubborn miracles. A student's eyes lighting up when a concept clicked, the messy honesty of a student's youthful questions. We fell into one another's lives like two people who had been given a map with different margins scribbled in. In the beginning, money and ambition were background noise. We were enamored with ideas. The future was a bright classroom where we both taught and learned. But life taught us differently. Frida's appetite for change had a direction, and it wasn't always the same as mine. She wanted growth, fast, visible, upward. She loved the idea of professional recognition, a move to a larger district, a resume that said Florida summers and sunlit professional development workshops. I loved the slow, accumulative work, A 10th grade class taught for 10 years, the long arc of a student's life where you were there at crucial moments. We argued, not with malice, but with friction. Friction can be productive until it isn't. Over the years, the arguments congealed around money in more ways than one. Not in the way people imagine, lavish spending, secret credit cards, but in the kind of conversation that forms like mildew in a damp room. Small complaints about not enough, when, in truth, we had enough, but not the kind of visibility she wanted. There were dinners where I'd listen to her sketch budgets for imagined projects, and I would nod, thinking we were complicit co-conspirators. We disagreed about risk. She wanted to leap. I wanted to build the ladder first. Where she saw patience as settling, I saw it as stewardship. Our marriage had been full of ordinary tenderness, coffee on Sundays, the way she would leave sticky notes on my desk when I had to grade through the night. But there were fissures. She started spending more time at the school's administrative office. She took calls in the parking lot, came home late, and smelled faintly of perfume that wasn't mine. I told myself at first that these were the little costs of ambition, late nights, new contacts, the mess of careers in motion. But people don't check their watch 7 times during their father-in-law's funeral because they're merely busy. The day after my father's diagnosis, I remember the house feeling like a place someone else owned. I had been up all night, talking with Margaret, making arrangements, trying to hold together next steps like thin glue. I went into the kitchen to get coffee and saw Frida on the back porch, phone pressed to her ear, moving gently like she was rehearsing her words.
I assumed she was speaking with a colleague, someone looking for a sympathetic ear. I didn't listen. Everyone deserves privacy in the face of death. But something in the cadence of her voice lodged like a stone in my throat. A week later, a neighbor told me she had seen Freda laughing with a man from work in the parking lot. I told myself not to read omens in other people's behavior. On the morning of the funeral, her distance was different. She wore a new coat, not because it suited the weather, but because it suited a look. Her makeup was meticulous in a way that said presentation rather than mourning. She touched my arm in the receiving line with a practiced sympathy that felt thin. Once, while Pastor Williams paused and we all bowed our heads, I watched the vein at her temple move as if she were clenching and unclenching an invisible fist. She checked her watch. I watched her check it again. People at funerals behave themselves according to policy. Keep voices low, walk with care, smile the correct sorrow. In my case, the performance was undermined by a small ongoing thing, her watch. 7 checks, 7 small betrayals. Some were literal betrayals, most were symbolic. Small motions that told me the story I refused to read. By the time we were at the burial, the air was a hard, brittle kind of cold. Margaret wrapped her coat tighter, and Angela placed a gloved hand over my mother's. I found myself walking the line between grief and suspicion, each step a startling oscillation. What kind of person checked the time while another person lowered a father into the ground? I didn't know the answer, only that the question sat like a seed in me, waiting to grow roots. Back at the house, people came and went. The neighborhood had a way of gathering, casseroles, nods, expressions of a grief that assumes the shape of shared history. Freda kept drifting toward the hallway where her phone lay, and then away. She made conversation with Aunt Joyce about my father's favorite pie, but it was a stilted, surface conversation, as if she was following a script and missing the cues. I should have been more attuned to the subtleties of the day. Maybe the grief fogged my perception, or maybe I was too willing to give her the benefit of the doubt. Grief has a way of softening the edges of reality until they blur into what you hope is true. I remember standing in the kitchen, a cup of coffee gone cold in my hand, while Freda stood by the sink looking out toward the yard. She twisted the dish towel in her hands the way some people twist their wedding ring when they're thinking. "Are you all right?" I asked, the question more performative than desperate. "Are you cold? Do you want to sit?" She turned, and something in her expression closed like a door. "I'm fine," she said. I'm just tired. It was then my phone buzzed. A text from Bauer, the principal at her old school, flashed on my screen. An innocuous message, professional, mentioning follow-up and opportunities. I felt a small, icy trickle run down my spine. I set the phone down. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it wasn't. The night after the funeral, excess energy kept me awake. I walked through the house like a ghost, touching objects for permission to exist. In my father's office, because there was always this urge to be near where he'd been, I found the little reminders of his life. A calendar pinned with done-to-the-day notes, a half-finished crossword, a pair of thick-lensed glasses resting on a notebook. The room smelt faintly of his cigar smoke and sawdust, a woodsy scent that belonged only to him. I stayed in that room until the house quieted. Once the murmurs of the evening had died away and the porch light blinked into darkness, I decided to go to bed. As I passed the hallway, I noticed the living room lamp was low, and I saw on the couch the faint glow of a phone screen. A photo of me and my father at graduation, my father beaming, me in a cap, flickered across her display when she shifted. The image of the two of us warmed me in a small way and then left me raw. At 2 in the morning, a noise from the kitchen made me stand up. I went to check and found nothing, only the refrigerator hummed. I told myself to sleep, to let the day's rights settle. But sleep wouldn't come. Instead, I paced. The living room clock, one my father had bought at a tag sale, ticked its patient rhythm. It had once made me angry for its stubbornness. It never let a moment pass quickly. Tonight, its ticking sounded like a metronome, counting down whatever it was the universe had set in motion. The day after, I found myself replaying the watch-checking in my head. How I had seen it as a trivial, almost rude habit, and how, in truth, it seemed to be the outward sign of an inward impatience. There was a history to impatience. When people are impatient with the pace of life, they often bargain with moral currency. Little trades here and there that, in the end, accumulate into something that costs more than they expected. Frida had always been impatient about time. She had been impatient about promotions, naming opportunities, recognition. That impatience, which I once mistook for drive and ambition, sometimes looked in the corners like something else, dissatisfaction that needed new scenery. I had believed in the slow accrual of worth, years of steady investing in students, relationships, and savings. But when ambition ran hot, patience felt like wasted heat. A week before the funeral, Angela mentioned over the phone, in that halting way sisters do when they want to sound casual about an uneasy thing, that Frida had been taking long lunches. "Just administrative stuff," Angela said. "You know how it is." I heard the "you know" as a conditional, a gentle test to see if I actually knew.
If it's something at work, maybe it's a good thing, I told her, choosing optimism like bandage. Maybe, she said, voice low. Just be careful, Kel. The words "be careful" are both a closure and an opening. They close the immediate issue and open the possibility of future pain. I was not yet ready to let the possibility in. 2 days after the funeral, I decided to return to the apartment early. I told no one. No one had to see the way I pulled apart the quiet of the house. No one had to witness the small, ridiculous things that comforted me. I wanted to be alone in the aftermath, to make the coffee the way he liked it, to listen to records he used to play, to allow the initial loop of grief to be just mine. When I pulled into our driveway, the apartment door was unlocked. My first thought was that I had left it unlocked. It was a stupid, domestic worry, but in grief, your mind scaffolds small realities to keep you upright. I stepped inside. The apartment smelled faintly of citrus, dish soap, and something else, perfumed and unfamiliar. In the living room light lay an open laptop with a professional email draft addressed to someone in Miami, a phrase underlined, "leadership opportunity." Papers were scattered on the table. School memos, a brochure about transformative educational spaces. Nothing seemed outright damning. Still, my stomach tightened.
I heard voices, low, casual, ordinary, and my first instinct was to retreat, to preserve the outline of myself. But curiosity has a gravity. It pulls you toward truth the way tide is pulled toward the moon. I moved closer to the hallway. There was a soft laugh, Freda's laugh, but lilted in a way that wasn't ours. A man's voice answered, smooth and practiced. I hadn't met him, but the voice carried a professional assurance I'd heard in conference calls, the kind that assumes consequence belongs to it. The name Bauer threaded through the sentences. He was her boss. He was in our apartment. My hands went cold. For a second, everything slowed. The tick of the living room clock, the breath in my lungs, the cadence of the man's voice. Each became an object I could study. I pressed myself to the wall, a single invisible witness, feeling at once ridiculous and the only person capable of seeing the scene unfold. Miami's ready to offer this position, the man was saying. We move quickly for people with vision. And you'll arrange everything? Freda's voice was small but not ashamed. She sounded like someone entering a negotiation where the stakes were not her heart, but a career. It'll be taken care of. Housing, the transition, a nice salary bump. You'll be leading a team within 2 years, guaranteed. You'd start the program there, and we'd move you ahead. There was a flippant currency to his words that made my skin prickle. The phrase guaranteed was like a stone sharpened for cutting. And Freda hesitated. What about here? What about the kids? What about... No kids to consider here, he said easily. And your husband he'll understand. People in our line of work understand these tough choices. This is how careers evolve. I could feel the blood drain out of my face. The phrase, your husband he'll understand, landed like a hand on the back of my neck. It told me that to him, to the man who sat in my living room, my presence was negotiable, a variable to be adjusted in the pursuit of professional goals, a transaction dressed up in the language of opportunity. I stepped into the doorway. For a moment, the apartment was a frozen photograph. Freda with her head tilted, a softness in her jaw as if pleading. The man, Bauer, smiling with the practiced nonchalance of someone who presumes the right to make choices for others. He turned, and his expression moved from welcome to calculation at the sight of me. There was a second, that nil second, where everything that had been implicit became explicit. Kelly, Freda said, as if name alone could stitch the seam that had just been torn. Hello, I said. My voice was flat, strange to my own ears. I felt like a stranger in my own life. Bauer stood up. Oh, Mr. Neal, I didn't realize. His apology was quick, too smooth, and then replaced by a kind of corporate charm that has, since time immemorial, been used to mollify the shocked and the betrayed. I was at the funeral, I said. The factuality of the statement steadied me. I came home early. They both shifted. Freda's hand, always so steady in the classroom, was not steady now. She glanced at the door, at me, at the phone on the coffee table, where the time glowed like an accusing eye. She checked her watch, almost as if instinct compelled her. I thought you were going to bed, she said. The words were small, as if spoken in a library. Figures were odd, I said. It was a poor joke that landed flat. All the humor in me had been siphoned away and replaced with a lucid, searing clarity. The repeated gesture, the phone calls, the lunches, the late nights. Suddenly, they weren't small things. They were signposts. Bauer recovered first. Mr. Neal, you don't understand the nature of the offer, he said. He used the word offer as if he were speaking of a grant, a prize, not the arrangement that my chest knew. My wife being encouraged to accept a proposition that included a man like him. Freda's eyes glistened. He says he'd get things set up so I could start in Miami. Her sentence broke. He offered you the position? I asked. And what did you offer in return? A shadow passed over her face, and I knew, with the kind of brutal certainty grief has a way of sharpening, that the watch-checking at my father's funeral had been a symptom of something else. Impatience, negotiated into an exchange. The thought was like a cold knife, that her impatience was not about time, but about trade, that her desire for opportunity came with a cost agreed in whisper. Bauer's hand found a glass on the coffee table. He lifted it as if to steady himself. You have to understand, this is how advancement happens. There's support, partnership. We'll make sure the transition is clean. His choice of words made me hear the literal sense of partnership in a way that felt ugly. This was not mentorship or sponsorship in the professional sense. This language had a different currency. To him, decisions were made in calculus neat enough to omit the human cost. I stood there and logged the shapes of their faces, the way cowardice and convenience sat side by side. There was no dramatic argument yet, no raised voices, just an awful slow clarity, like a photograph developing until every detail snapped into focus. Frida looked at me, and for a second I saw her as if I had never married her. A person with a history, with small nervous habits, with reasons that no longer mattered to the moment. She was not a villain in comic ink. She was a frightened person who had made a choice. That did not make the choice unshakable. It made it human. You don't have to explain, I said. My voice surprised me, calm, almost clinical. I heard enough. Bauer opened his mouth, and for a moment I thought about what men like him do. They spin narratives until the truth is so thin it slips away. They offer plausible promises and call moral compromise necessary steps. I thought about my father, who would tell me, with that steady, practical tone, that a man is measured by what he does when no one is looking. He would have said the same if I asked him what to do then. Act like a man of integrity. I stepped toward them. I didn't reach for him, didn't threaten. Instead, I took out my phone, the same one that had buzzed earlier, and started a voice memo. Maybe it was the shock, maybe it was instinct, but I pressed record and let the room hold the sound of their words. You would think that in moments like that, you'd plan carefully. In reality, survival seizes what little control it can, and a recording felt like one scrap of control I could gnaw on. "Are you doing that?" Frida whispered. "Yes," I said, "I'm recording." Bauer scoffed. "You want to stoop to that?" He meant it in the smug way people mean if they think themselves above small morality. He was used to the world bending around him. He was used to a different set of consequences. "If anyone asks what happened here," I said, "it will be on record." It was not a dramatic threat. I didn't threaten exposure like a headline. Instead, I stated a fact. There would be a record of what was said in our living room. Not as revenge, not as spectacle, but as an accounting. I wanted to see myself making a choice to resist the hot vent of anger and instead gather the facts. Anger is a useful engine only if it is steered. Frida leaned forward, and for the first time that day, her voice broke enough to sound like grief. "Kelly, Don't," I said, the single syllable a scalpel. "Don't explain. You can explain later if you want. Right now, I need to know if you're going to the flight to Miami. I need to know what you're planning." She looked at Bauer. You could see the calculus in the way she weighed shame against self-advancement. Her eyes came back to me. "It's complicated," she said. "It's about me," I replied, "or about us." "About your lack of willingness to," she started. "Save it," I said. "This isn't the time for lectures." And there it was, the division that had been forming, not in a day, nor in a year, but in the slow choices that accumulate like deposits in an account. I thought then of my father counting his dimes and folding them into something that would outlast him. I thought about the slow, invisible compounding of things that matter: attention, kindness, the act of showing up. Bauer cleared his throat and offered a conciliatory smile. "Mr. Neal, we're prepared to handle the transition with discretion. We don't want to make this more difficult." Discretion, I repeated softly. It sounded like a stitch in a wound. I pressed stop on the recording. Not because I wanted to hide what I'd captured, but because I wanted to hold that moment inside me, to feel its edges before I acted. I had, in a single action, laid a thin thread between what I knew and what I would need to do. I left the apartment then, not with the slammed doors of a melodrama, but with a measured step. I walked to the car and sat there for a long time, letting the engine chill while the November wind tasted like closed chapters. My hands trembled, but I kept my pulse steady. The anger that rose in me was like a flame, hot, raw, but not uncontrollable. I had choices. I thought of my father's hand, calloused and patient, the way he had taught me to take inventory before acting. Driving to my mother's house felt like moving through a fogged glass. I thought about how to tell Margaret and Angela, how to fold this new, terrible knowledge into the existing grief. I wanted to be honest, but I also wanted to be strategic, practical, like my father. This was not simply a personal betrayal. It was a disruption that carried implications for family, finances, and the futures we had imagined. When I walked back into the house, the living room felt charged, as if a storm had left an electric aftertaste. Margaret saw me and did not ask immediately. She read me like those of a generation trained to notice small signs. Her hands found mine, and for a moment we shared the desperate language of people who do not know how to fill silence. "Everything all right?" she asked, voice small. I could have lied, said the shock of losing my father was enough to make me erratic. I could have said I was tired. Instead, I said no. I let the one word hang between us. Angela moved closer, her eyes wide and bright, with that way siblings have of expecting to be included. I told them, slowly, the necessary parts. That there had been a conversation at the apartment, that Bauer had been there, that the tone had been of an arrangement rather than a mere job offer. I did not play the recording for them. I told them I had one, that it existed, that it would probably become necessary. I watched the air change. They did not look at Frida as we spoke. The house felt small and intimate, as if one private breach had become a communal thing. Margaret said nothing for a long moment. Eventually she asked, Do you think it was about money?" The question hurt, not because it was untrue, but because it simplified something that felt monstrously complex. I thought of my father slaving at the factory, of his thrift and humility, and I thought, money often shows itself as the symptom rather than the disease. It was about opportunity and impatience, I said, and maybe about what people are willing to trade. In the days that followed, I moved like someone rearranging fragile things. I called Daniel Morrison, the family lawyer we'd used in the past for minor stuff, and made a quiet appointment. I told Margaret I was going to speak to our accountant. I wanted to keep certain things measured and contained. Legal maneuvers would come later. For now, there were smaller tasks. Clear the apartment of delicate evidence, document belongings, call HR if necessary. But I also felt a deeper itch, a gut knowledge that this was not only about marital failure. It was about the possibility that my father had left something else behind, a ledger of patient work, whose consequences would be far-reaching. I found myself drifting back to the funeral more than I should. I rewound moments in my head. Pastor William's sermon about endurance, my father's small, crooked smile when he caught me looking at him from the casket, the way Frida's hand had brushed mine in the receiving line and then moved elsewhere. Scenes rearranged themselves into a narrative I did not want to live. And then, like a bell chiming faintly at the edge of a room, a letter arrived. No, not a letter yet, only the image of a sealed envelope. It belonged in my father's desk, someplace my grief had not yet dared to open. I told myself that opening it would be a betrayal of mourning. But there are moments when grief and curiosity conspire into courage. There are moments when the living have to know the truth to honor the dead's choices.
The idea of sitting at his old desk, paper soft under my hands, felt like phoning a man who could no longer answer. Presumptuous, but necessary. That night, I dreamed of numbers and gardens, of compounding and patience. And as dawn leaked into the windows, I made a choice that I thought would be purely practical. After I had taken care of the immediate, after I had secured our living arrangements and spoken with our lawyer, I would open his desk, find his papers, and see if he had left anything that would help us now. I found myself drifting back to the funeral more than I should. I rewound moments in my head. Pastor William's sermon about endurance, my father's small, crooked smile when he caught me looking at him from the casket, the way Frida's hand had brushed mine in the receiving line and then moved elsewhere. Scenes rearranged themselves into a narrative I did not want to live. And then, like a bell chiming faintly at the edge of a room, a letter arrived. No, not a letter yet, only the image of a sealed envelope. It belonged in my father's desk, someplace my grief had not yet dared to open. I told myself that opening it would be a betrayal of mourning. But there are moments when grief and curiosity conspire into courage. There are moments when the living have to know the truth to honor the dead's choices. The idea of sitting at his old desk, paper soft under my hands, felt like phoning a man who could no longer answer. Presumptuous, but necessary. That night, I dreamed of numbers and gardens, of compounding and patience. And as dawn leaked into the windows, I made a choice that I thought would be purely practical. After I had taken care of the immediate, after I had secured our living arrangements and spoken with our lawyer, I would open his desk, find his papers, and see if he had left anything that would help us now.
I told myself I would do it with reverence, with the steadiness my father would have asked of me. What followed felt like a folding of the world on itself, loss intersecting with betrayal, and both intersecting with a legacy I had not yet imagined. The sequence, funeral, suspicion, discovery, retorting, had placed me at a crossroad. I could, in the moment, choose the rawness of retaliation and expose everything publicly. Or I could do something quieter, more bewildering, gather facts, seek counsel, and shape a path that reflected the values my father had quietly taught: patience, stewardship, and dignity. I did not know the estate numbers or what the account statements would show. I only knew that the watch checking, the phone calls, the Miami job offer were a rupture that demanded a response. I also knew, with the kind of deep, marrow-level certainty that follows major loss, that whatever I did next would have to honor my father's life by staying honest. He had not been a man of spectacle. He was a man who made small, steady deposits into the future. And perhaps, just perhaps, those deposits had accumulated into something that would change the arithmetic of our lives. The next afternoon, while Margaret made calls and Angela sat with her sketchbook, I drove to the family law office. Daniel Morrison had a patience that looked like a map. He listened as I told him what had happened, and when I said Bauer's name, his face tightened in a way that suggested the scale of what we might be dealing with. Keep the recording, he advised, in that careful, guarded way lawyers have when they know their words will be held up to the light. Document everything, and be discreet. Discreet in what sense? I asked. In the sense that public spectacle makes financial and legal maneuvering more complicated. Sometimes the quiet approach yields better options. I left his office with an instruction and no decision. The lawyer had not told me to act one way or another. He had laid open the map of options. He had not offered moral counsel. He had offered professional parameters. That suited me. I did not want advice disguised as certainty. I wanted to proceed from a place of deliberateness. Back home, in the quiet of my father's office, I sat at the desk that smelled of wood glue and old ink. It was where he had paid bills, written notes, and perhaps, as I now suspected, made decisions that would come to light only now. The drawer stuck, as drawers will when used often and with purpose. When it finally eased open, the sound in the quiet house felt like a small revelation. There, in a neat, upright envelope, was a letter addressed to me in his blocky, practical handwriting.
For Kelly, open when you have to make a decision. It was an instruction both tender and exact, a father's last admonition framed as a task. The handwriting was the same that had scrawled lunch notes and checklists. It was not grand, but it was exact.
I felt the peculiar trepidation of someone who knows they are about to meet a father in full presence, even though he is gone. I sat with the envelope in my hands, feeling the paper warm to my skin. Outside, the wind picked up, and somewhere down the street a dog barked like a question. I slit the envelope open and pulled out neat stacks of statements, meticulous entries showing deposits and buy-ins, and a patience that read like a moral ledger. There were letters from brokers, statements from retirement accounts, records of small, consistent investments, an early Amazon buy, a few shares of a then obscure tech company he had simply thought a good idea. A steady stream of 401k contributions matched over decades. Numbers that, when added with the patience of compounding, transmogrified into something larger than the sum of their parts. My first, entirely childish reaction was incredulity. My father a millionaire? The idea felt as foreign as him speaking in a different voice. He had not liked money for money's sake. He liked the way it made possible small freedoms, a trip once a year, a new set of tools, support for relatives who needed it. His thrift had never been penurious, it had been disciplined, the slow accumulation of small habits that become fortunes when unmolested by show. A folded note fell out of the pile. His handwriting was slanted, the ink a bit faded. "Kelly," it began, "if you are reading this, then the world has asked things of me I did not expect. I have tried to do right by you all. Use what I've left to do good. Don't waste the peace this can buy." The letter was short, no detailed instructions, no blow-by-blow of wills and trusts, but the tone was unmistakable. A man who had understood the quiet power of time. The statements, too, suggested a life careful with opportunity. Investments made in dribs and drabs, reinvested dividends, patience that had been rewarded not by luck, but by steady resolve. I sat back and felt my mouth go dry. That small room, which had been a repository of grief, now felt like a chapel of revelation. I felt both grateful and furious. Grateful because my father had thought to provide for us, furious because such provision felt like an answer to a problem I didn't yet know how to face. If the estate was substantial, then this shifted the axis of everything. My choices, my obligations, the way I might respond to Freda in this arrangement. Money, which had felt immaterial in the face of betrayal, suddenly became a practical lever for protecting the future. But money alone was never the lesson. I felt my father's voice, not in words, but in the grain of the wood under my palms, telling me that the true inheritance wasn't only dollars. It was the patience that made those dollars possible. The ordinary faithfulness of a man who showed up every day to do his job, who invested in quiet ways. I thought of the compound interest examples I'd once taught on a blackboard to sleepy high school seniors, and I understood them differently now, not as numbers but as metaphors for life. The discovery reframed my grief. Where I had been aimless and raw, I now found a cold, careful clarity. The injustice of the earlier scene, the man in my living room, the offer of Miami, the watch checking at the funeral, had not been erased. It had been placed into the context of a deeper truth, that my father had been building something silently, and that his silence had been an act of trust toward us. The truth broke me, but in the way that breakage sometimes allows new light in. I had choices, all imperfect. I could expose what I had learned in a way that would punish, humiliate, or satisfy immediate anger. Or I could step into a more measured role, to preserve my father's legacy, to protect my family, to address betrayal with legal and ethical channels rather than spectacle. The path forward required a kind of courage I had not yet earned. The courage not to be undone by pain, but to let pain be the engine that carved a purposeful life.
I placed the documents back into the envelope and slid it into my jacket. The house felt charged, as if it sheltered both past and future. I needed counsel, I needed time, and I needed to decide how to carry the knowledge of Bauer's presence in our living room and the revelation of my father's quiet fortune. It felt like standing at a fork in a road that would determine not just my future, but the shape of who I would be for the rest of my life. I made the appointment with Daniel. I called Margaret and Angela and told them only that there were things to discuss. I did not, in those early hours, call Freda's employer or broadcast the recording. I did not post anything online. I chose discretion, not because I feared being righteous, but because my father's lessons had taught me the long game, that quick victories often dissolve into empty noise. There is a peculiar, almost perverse relief that comes from finding out your life is more complicated than you thought. It confirms the presence of something real beneath the performative layers. For the first time since the funeral, I slept. It was a shallow sleep, carved out by the knowledge that a larger plan was possible. When I woke, the house felt like a house that held a secret. The secret was heavy and potentially dangerous, but it was mine to steward. I made coffee, opened the blinds, and watched the November light spill across the hallway, illuminating dust like distant stars. My father's letter sat on the kitchen table, a small, firm instruction in a world that had otherwise felt untethered. I knew the days ahead would be full of procedural things, meeting with lawyers, inventorying assets, deciding on how to proceed in the marriage. But I also knew that how I handled those procedural things would define the moral shape of the response.
There was a temptation, natural and human, to seek quick retribution, to let the public see Freda's misstep and let her reputation be the punishment. I thought of what that would do to Margaret, to Angela, to the small community that had come to entomb my father. I thought of how my father would have watched such a spectacle and shook his head. Instead, I felt something else taking shape, a resolve to protect the quiet dignity of what my father had built and to use it in a way that would keep our family intact where possible, deliver justice where appropriate, and build something lasting for our community. It was not a noble idea in the abstract. It was terrifyingly practical and required restraint. That afternoon, as the light slid across the kitchen table, I sat with the envelope open between my hands and felt the careful arithmetic of my father's life settle on my lap like a weight I had to learn to carry. The numbers were precise and boring in their way. Account statements, reinvestment notices, a few odd shares bought when a company's name was still a rumor. But when you let time do the heavy lifting, small things compound into something that can change the shape of a family. My father had let time do the lifting. I called Daniel and told him plainly that there were two parallel tracks now: the estate to be tended and a marital breach that had to be addressed without turning our grief into a spectacle. Discretion, he said again when I finished. That's our asset here. He spoke in the measured, lawyerly voice that makes difficult choices feel less like cliffs and more like maps. He told me, too, that the recording could be useful. In our case, he qualified, it establishes context. He did not promise outcomes. He offered options and the scaffolding to hold my decisions. In the days that followed, I split my life like you would split a piece of wood, one careful cut for practicalities and another for feeling. I cataloged the papers from my father's desk into folders: retirement, taxable accounts, brokerage statements, and made copies. I met with an accountant who translated the jargon into language that didn't require a degree in finance: taxes, possible liquidity, a rough estimate of what might be available if managed prudently. The number wound through every meeting like a low, constant drum, enough to be meaningful, not enough to be careless. The accountant nodded at my question about divvying assets and said, "This is about stewardship." The word felt like my father, who had always said stewardship like a benediction. I also met with an HR attorney, not to weaponize the recording, but to understand options. Daniel advised me to be low on rhetoric and high on documentation. We left the recording as a contingency, proof held in reserve. The idea was not to punish in public, but to ensure safety and integrity. In our case, that meant presenting facts to Freda's employer and giving them a chance to act. 2 weeks later, after Daniel spoke with the HR director at the school, Bauer was quietly reassigned and an internal inquiry began. There was no melodramatic showdown, only an administrative rearrangement that unspooled his power. He did not contact me again. The point, Daniel said, was to minimize collateral damage, protect Mom and Angela from gossip, preserve the dignity of the school, and, if possible, allow for remorse. When it came time to address the marriage, I surprised myself. I could have filed the most brutal, headline-grabbing petition and let the world decide who had been right. Instead, I thought of the letter my father had left, his insistence that peace not be wasted. I thought of the long game of patiently made investments, of the tiny acts that become landscapes. I sat down with Freda across from me at the kitchen table, and for the first time since the funeral, we had to speak in the absent man's name. Our conversation was neither cinematic nor confessional in the way people imagine. There were no accusations hurled for the sake of drama. There was instead a kind of inventory. This is what happened, this is how I felt, these are the facts I have. She listened. Sometimes listening is the backbone of accountability. I made a mistake, she said at one point, voice small in a way that made me remember the laughter that had come to our house in the early years. I was angry about things I thought I deserved. I thought the Miami thing would fix that. Did you think you were trading us for it? I asked, because I needed a direct answer. She hesitated, and in that pause I saw the person she had been, tired, ambitious, capable of lapses that did not entirely explain away her choices. She said finally, I thought maybe I could have both. I thought I could leave and come back, or that leaving would mean something different. It was an answer that did not absolve and did not excuse. It was human. We engaged lawyers and drew up terms. Daniel was firm on one point. Treat marital property with fairness. Keep inherited assets distinct. What your father left is not marital property, and in our case, the way it is titled matters, he said. He couched everything in the language of in our case and as advised, and I liked that. I did not want the narrative of my life turned into a template for strangers. I wanted to do things that fit our story. The divorce, when it came, moved without the theatrics I had imagined. Freda accepted a fair settlement of marital assets and chose to leave the house. Part of me wanted to insist on scorched earth terms. Part of me, a larger, steadier part, refused to allow my father's quiet work to be used as a weapon. He had not built a fortune to fund angry spectacles. He had built it to give his family options. I offered Freda a reasonable timetable to relocate and a stipend for the transition, terms that protected my mother and Angela from immediate instability. In exchange, she agreed to maintain discretion and to seek counseling, the latter not as a condition so much as a wish for both of us to heal. There is a perverse relief in taking the deliberate path. Choosing dignity did not make the betrayal less painful. It simply kept the pain precise, contained it instead of letting it go viral. Once the divorce was filed and the terms were agreed on by our lawyers, I felt something I had not expected, a softening, not of betrayal into forgiveness, but of rage into a kind of resolute focus. Civil life required things that fury alone could not buy. I started, slowly, to fold my father's legacy into a plan that would honor the values I now knew he had intended for us. The first thing I did was to talk to Margaret about travel. She had always spoken of seeing her family one more time in Taiwan, of walking the rice terraces she had described in the half-light of our kitchen, and of seeing the temple where she had once been married. We used part of the funds, modestly, to book a trip for her and Angela. There are things I need to see again, she said, surprising me with how ready she was to go. It felt right to let her step into that wish while the rest of us steadied. Next came the scholarship. I remember standing in front of a whiteboard in a community center one night, drafting possibilities for what the money could do. If my father taught me anything, it was this: small, steady investments in people yield the highest return. The scholarship would be for local first-generation college students, kids whose parents worked late shifts and whose courage to try mattered more than any polished resume. I wanted the scholarship to be practical: tuition support, a laptop, and maybe most importantly, a summer mentorship program where students could spend time with teachers who actually showed up for them. I named it the Richard Neal Scholarship, not as a monument, but as an invitation. A man who worked in a factory believed in education enough to make it possible for others. Setting up the scholarship required work I had never done before: conversations with a community college, filings with a nonprofit set up by Daniel to administer the fund, interviews with potential mentors. Each step felt like building a bridge across a canyon my father had quietly expected us to cross. When I told my students, no, when I told them about the scholarship, there was a sound in the classroom that is hard to describe: the small, astonished silence of people who realize something previously impossible has become possible. I taught that lesson on compound interest in a new way after the scholarship was established. I wrote the story of my father's slow investments on the board as a metaphor. Patience is a muscle. It has to be exercised. The students listened. Some of them had never heard the word compound without it being attached to debt. The hardest part, surprisingly, was telling Angela.
She was the person who had been the quiet witness to everything. Present at the funeral, at our kitchen conversations, the sketchbook keeper of the family's anxieties and small joys. "Do you want to help decide who gets the first scholarships?" I asked her one afternoon, hoping she would say yes. She did. We sat in the dining room with a stack of applications and coffee, reading about kids who worked after school, who helped their siblings, who had the kind of grit my father would have recognized. Choosing recipients felt like an act of worship. The more public project took shape slowly. I wanted something that would last beyond scholarships. A place where adults could take night classes, where GED seekers could get help, where kids could take robotics without assuming it's only for rich schools. Daniel helped set up a nonprofit in our father's name. We converted an old storefront into classrooms with donated desks and secondhand computers. The community rallied in ways I had not expected. Former students who had drifted into other careers showed up to help paint. The union at the factory donated time and tools. Neighbors brought lasagnas and sawed in the evenings. The opening day was a small thing by city standards, but a huge thing for the street. Balloons not in corporate colors, but in mismatched shades that made the place feel like home. On the day the Richard Neal Community Learning Center opened, the air was the brittle, bright kind of fall that seems to promise hard work and honest reward. Margaret wore a scarf my father would have liked. Angela had pinned a button to her coat that read, "For Rick," in a handwriting she had modeled after our father's. The ceremony was short. I spoke, because I am a teacher, and that's what we do when asked to give words. I said what I believed: that wealth is not only a bank balance, but an invitation to give others time to grow. I said it without grandiosity. The room was full of faces who did not want rhetoric, just actions. Frida came to the opening. She stood at the back at first, as if the air of the room were a thing she had to earn the right to breathe. Her presence was complicated, part remorse, part curiosity, part a wish to see what had been made without her. She did not seek applause. When she walked up afterward, we did not hug. There was no theater in our greeting, just a quiet exchange of names and what had happened since. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Her eyes were wet, but not performative. "I know," I said. I meant it with the particular gravity of a person who had sat at his father's desk and read the ledger of a life. "I'm glad you came." There is something unshowy and real about a person admitting their underside in a room full of people they have wronged. Frida's apology did not rewind anything.
It did not make my father live again, and it did not make my marriage whole. But it allowed both of us to stand in the same place and see with a little more honesty what had been broken.
The center began to hum with life. A 12-week basic coding course filled up in 3 days. A retired machinist taught night classes on tool maintenance, his hands moving in time with the machines like a second language. I taught a series called Money as a Tool, Not a Goal, where we unpacked how compound interest works, but more importantly, how patience in relationships, careers, and community projects compounds in similar ways. I used my father's story as an example, not as bragging, but as a lesson in elasticity. Small, steady acts can carry enormous weight over time. There were practicalities to manage. We had paperwork, tax forms, grant applications. Daniel kept returning to his instruction. Keep the inherited funds structured so they would fuel the projects, not be swallowed by administrative overhead. In our case, that meant establishing an endowment and budgeting for sustainable programs. I learned the arcane, satisfying pleasure of spreadsheets, the way predictable inflows can meet community needs without devouring the capital. My father, the man who had been suspicious of showy wealth, would have understood the sanctity of budgeting. Time passed, as it always does. The divorce was finalized, the house sold to someone who would plant new flowers in my father's garden. There were intimate and difficult conversations. Frida received counseling, made amends of a practical sort where she could, and moved to a new city where she took a job that aligned more with her stated values. She wrote a letter to my mother and Angela, apologizing with the specificity my mother had said she needed. Not only "I'm sorry," but "I understand now what I did and why it hurt." My mother read the letter aloud at lunch one day, and the house felt fragile and true. In the quiet after the legal work, I made a choice to travel to my father's childhood town. I wanted to see the places that had shaped him, the park where he learned the patience of fishing, the old high school where a guidance counselor had told him college wouldn't be for everyone, words he had taken as an instruction to make other kinds of banked reserves in his life. The town was smaller than the memory, as these places always are. The river where he had skipped stones was narrower. The house where he had grown up had a new coat of paint. Standing there, I felt the strange sensation of meeting a man I had loved and also only begun to understand. On the last morning of the trip, I walked to the bench where my father had once smoked with an old friend, the sky a pale, forgiving blue. I took out his letter, worn now at the edges, and read it out loud, not because I expected an answer, but because the act of speaking folded the past into something I could hold. "Use what I've left to do good," he had written. I could hear his voice like the echo of a tool being put back in a drawer. I thought of the scholarships, the late-night classes, the machinists teaching kids how to weld.
I thought of patience as a way of making the future tender. When I returned, the center had its first small miracles. A young woman who had been the first scholarship recipient came by to say she'd been accepted into a state college. A single father enrolled in a night class that would help him get a promotion. The small returns, students who stayed in school, people who gained a new trade, felt like interest payments from my father's investment in time. I began to measure success not by headlines, but by steady increments. More students enrolling, better retention rates, a steady stream of volunteers. People often ask why I kept teaching, why I would spend my weekends in the center when I could step into a job that paid more and took less emotional labor. The answer was simple. Because teaching is where the life I wanted and the life my father imagined intersected. Money can buy comfort, but it can't buy the peculiar satisfaction of being one of the adults in a room when something clicks for a student. You don't get the instant gratification that other paths promise. You get the slow, accumulating joy of seeing people build, day by day. Years later, on an anniversary I did not mark publicly, Margaret traveled to Taiwan. She sent back photos of the temple lights and a video of the rice terraces swaying like a green ocean. Angela and I sat by the window and watched her scroll through the images. "He would have liked this," Margaret said. And the way she said it made me know my father had been part of her map as much as he had been mine. Frida and I did not reconcile in the sense of returning to marriage. There are some things that cannot be mended into what they once were without erasing the truth of their breaking. But there was, over time, a civility and an honesty that replaced sharp edges. She came to the center a handful of times with a stack of books to donate and stayed long enough to sit in a class and listen. Once, after a seminar on classroom management, she lingered and said, "I always loved the work." The confession was small and honest, and not a gateway to anything except acknowledgement. The kind of admission that can be the beginning of repair, not in the sense of restoration, but in the sense of learning to live differently. The last piece of closure, if closure is even ever a thing one fully achieves, came when a young teacher I had mentored, someone who had started in our 10th grade class and now led the Saturday coding club, stood at the podium at a modest fundraising dinner and spoke about how the center had changed a boy's life. He told the story of a kid who had been failing math and had found a teacher who would meet him after school, week after week. The boy went on to study engineering. When the teacher finished, the room applauded not for me, but for the possibility the center had created. That night, as the lights went down and the volunteers stacked chairs, I felt a softness that was not the absence of pain, but the presence of something that had been built in spite of it. In quieter moments, I still think of the day in the chapel, of the watch checked 7 times, of the breath that felt like a metronome you couldn't stop. The revelation at the funeral, both the betrayal in the living room and the legacy in my father's desk, broke me in ways that pried open parts of myself I didn't know were sealed. But being broken is not the same as being destroyed. Sometimes it reveals the seams where you can stitch something new. I spent the money my father left not on ostentation, but on options. For my mother to see her homeland, for students to have mentors, for adults to learn trades that would give them dignity. I preserved the capital so the work could continue. I funded scholarships so a different kind of impatience, this time the one that's fueled by opportunity rather than restlessness, could take hold. I taught students what compound interest felt like when applied to relationships and careers, not only bank accounts. I insisted over and over that patience is not passive. It is the long effort of showing up, of keeping a steady hand on the tiller while months and years do the quiet work. The man who practiced patience was never flashy. He didn't need to be. He would have hated the idea of being called a millionaire because that would miss the point. He had worked steady shifts, shopped for bargains, put dividends back to work. He invested in things that don't announce themselves, regular pension contributions, $10 investments, repairs instead of replacements. Those are the quiet acts that make a life that can be used to help others when the time comes. If there is a single thread that runs through all of this, it's a choice I was forced to make on a small, stunned afternoon. To let sorrow and betrayal define my response, or to let them refine it. I chose the latter, not out of stoicism, but out of a respect for the man whose desk had whispered to me after he was gone. He had, in his plain and careful way, left a summons. Use this to make room for other people's chances. A friend asked me, months into the work, whether I felt vindicated by the way things had turned out. My answer was immediate. No, I said, I feel responsible. Vindication tastes like a brief, hollow candy compared to the slow, nourishing bread of responsibility. I thought about the men who had sat in my living room, about Bauer and his office, about Frida and her ambition, and realized that responsibility was the only currency I wanted to spend against them. There were nights when I still heard the watch ticking in my head, a remnant from the chapel, a metronome of impatience. But now when that sound comes, I try to translate it into something my father taught without ever saying. count not the minutes, but the deposits.
Put your labor and your love where patience can do its work. The Learning Center stands a few blocks from the factory where my father once worked. Often, when I leave my classroom at dusk, I walk by and see the lights on, coding in one room, adult literacy in another. Those lights feel like small constellations mapped by people who chose to show up. I think of my father's hands, calloused, steady, and I try to move with the same humility he did. On quiet mornings, I hold the letter again. I tuck it back in the envelope and put it in my jacket like a talisman and a directive. It reminds me who we are and what we owe each other. Patience, stewardship, the courage to choose dignity when fury would be cheaper and louder. You asked in the beginning what I would do if this happened to you. I cannot tell you what to do. This is our case. Your life will ask different things. But I can tell you what the funeral's hidden truth taught me. That the visible moment of loss can conceal an act of provision, and that betrayal can reveal what you value. Not by making choices for you, but by forcing your choices into the light. The man who checked his watch 7 times at a funeral revealed a weakness. The man who, for decades, bought a single share and reinvested the dividends revealed a strength. Which one do you want to honor? If this story moved you, or if you face something like it and wonder what you would have done, tell me below. What would you have done in my place? And if you want to hear more stories that cut at the seams between grief, money, and what it means to build a life, subscribe and we'll keep walking through them together.